Okay, so now we're going to look at how you can solder larger connectors like these guys. It requires more heat and patience to not burn yourself, but the basic steps are more or less the same. So the first thing you want to do is, again, tin the wires. This again is a way to make sure that you have a good connection and you're not just soldering kind of the surface of the wires. So put a little solder on the tip of the soldering iron, and then when you're applying the solder, make sure you're applying it from the other side on the wire so that you are making sure it's actually getting sucked into everything there. And again, the smoke coming off is the flux from the solder, and you want nice fresh solder on any joint you do. The next step is to tin the wires on the connectors. Now, it's always a good idea when you're soldering big connectors to actually put it in the mating one, because as you heat it up, you can melt the plastic, and that can cause it to, the pins to move out of place, whereas if it's in its mate, you're less likely to do that. Okay, so this can get pretty hot. So I just use again kind of tools I have at hand to hold things in place. And what I want to do is basically, again, get a little bit of solder on the iron, but then mostly I'm going to try to apply heat to it and let the solder melt on the metal itself, not just putting a glob on there, and that makes sure that it actually is a good connection. And this, takes a little while to heat this up, but then once it gets hot enough, I can then get a lot of solder going in there. Again, it can take a little while. Okay, now it's hot enough and it's flowing in. And with this, I get it hot, and then I can just put my wire in. And I want to make sure that it actually gets in there, and like here, if you take it out, or if you don't wait long enough, it doesn't melt the solder on the wire. Now the key thing is that it can actually take a little while then to cool off, so you don't want to pull it out immediately, otherwise it'll just fall off or not be a good connection. Okay, and I can do the same thing on the other side. Again, gotta start it heating up, and it takes a little while to get hot enough. But once it does, then you can put a whole bunch of solder in here. And then you can take your wire, and again, like, you want to make sure you don't just pull it out quickly or something like that, because then it doesn't, and right now it's hard to move around. I want to get it so that it means it cooled off too much in there, so you want to ideally get it so that it's all fluid in there, and then remove it and let it cool for a while, because again, you'll burn yourself if you do this too quickly. Okay, so after you've let it cool for a while, you can take it off, and then, as always, it's a good idea to put heat shrink tubing. Now, if you're soldering this to something that already has ends, you want to make sure that you put the heat shrink tubing on before you start soldering, because it's always a big pain when you solder something only to find that you have to desolder it to get the heat shrink tubing on. So I'll do this, and then use my heat gun. Okay, so that's pretty good. And then one thing I like to do on connectors like this, if they don't come with some other casing, you can add some reinforcement by actually putting another layer of heat shrink that's larger over it. One trick I use is actually to use some super glue on it to get it to really stick onto the connector, because if you just heat shrink it, then when you start to pull the heat shrink or pull the connector by the heat shrink, it'll just come off, and of course my glue is clogged. So if you just put a little bit of super glue on the connector here, and on the other side, and when you heat shrink it, it'll not only form a tighter seal, but it'll actually stay in place. So now I can heat shrink this. You can also do things like actually fold it around while it's still hot. It's quite hot, but that's okay. And now that glue will hold it in place so that it won't pull off as easily, and then you have something to hold on to and grab and provide stress relief from the motion of the wires.